The next topic we're going to take a look at in our exploration of social psychology is the idea of the social self. And the social self, the concept of that is that it's how we see ourselves through our relationships with other people. And so it's almost kind of looking at like how do we define ourselves based on the part we play in our family or our friend group or at the office, wherever that might be. But it's how we see ourselves in relationship to the other people that we're around. The social self was an idea of a man named William James. Now, you may remember talking about William James in Psych 101. This is one of the founding fathers of psychology. He's an American. He actually is given credit for writing the first psychology textbook. And so, really, he and Wilhelm Wundt help establish psychology as a social science really towards the end of the 1800s. He defined the social self as self knowledge that is derived from social relationships. So it's what we know about ourselves, but we learn that through our interactions and our relationships with other people. There are three components that social psychologists say we use to understand self. Got a picture there for you on the screen of a famous self portrait done by a man named Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was famous, did some famous work in World War II, but also there was a magazine called the Saturday Evening Post, and he did a lot of covers or back covers for the Saturday Evening Post, kind of a classic American artist. And so I always thought that image of him looking at himself in the mirror, drawing a picture of himself, but he's drawing this picture too. So it kind of make your head hurt trying to figure out how many different levels of self maybe he's taking a look at. But we've got three. The first is what's called the individual self. The individual self is how you see you. What are your beliefs about yourself? And so usually these are made up of traits that we think we have. So maybe we're smart, or we're kind, or we're conscientious, right? Traits that we think. And then it's also the areas where we believe we're talented, the things that we personally think we're good at. And so those are the components that are going to make up the individual self. My belief about my traits, the things that I've been born with and that I have, and then how those traits are expressed through my talents. And so when you think about it on that level, we all have certain beliefs of things that we think we're good at, maybe even things we think we're not very good at. And a lot of that comes from kind of this inner monologue that we all have going all the time that helps us kind of process and think about ourselves. The second component of self is what's called the relational self. Now, the relational self is based on specific relationships. So, your relationship with your parents, your relationship later on in life with your spouse, your children, your siblings. We take on characteristics of those relationships, right? You're the doting spouse, right? So, you are a husband or wife who's very concerned about your partner. You do what you can to take care of your partner. To try and meet their needs. Maybe you're the black sheep of the family. You kind of look and say, hey, my brothers and sisters are the ones that really are pleasing my parents. And maybe even you go out of your way to be a little different. Or maybe you're not trying to be a little different, but you still feel like you're not the favorite of your parents, or you're not the favored child. Great example is if you've ever seen The Big Bang Theory. The character of Leonard has a brother and sister, kind of has a famously icy relationship with his mother, who's a psychologist. And his mother is usually much more complimentary of the brother and sister and their achievements. And so it really goes into making up a lot of who Leonard feels like he is. Being the good child in a parent child relationship. So pretty much when we have, even with like your friend groups, right? There will be somebody who is kind of the mom of the group, right? It doesn't even have to be a female, but somebody that takes care of everybody, somebody that does a lot of the meeting the needs of people in the group. Those types of things can be what's the role that you're playing relationally. The last one's called the collective self, and the collective self is where we connect ourselves to larger bodies of people. And so, what groups do we belong to? Maybe you belong to a church, and that church has got specific beliefs about altruistic behavior, or how people are supposed to act, dress, those sorts of things. And so that's part of who you are. You're part of this group. It could be a particular ethnic group, right, that you feel like you're a part of. And so there are certain things from that community that you hang on to. Could be being a sports fan, right? One of the things that got coined maybe in the last 10 years is the idea, the Red Sox have Red Sox Nation. And as that baseball team started to get good in the early 2000s after kind of a long dry spell, people started to affiliate with that team, wear the hats, wear the shirts, watch the games. But it really doesn't matter where you're at. You could be in California and there'd be a Red Sox fan. One of the things that I belong to is the Indiana University Alumni Association. They have gatherings all over the country, right? Where if you're in New York City but you're an IU alumnus, they'll hook you up with a group of IU fans to watch a basketball game or a football game, or to do something like that to contribute to that sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself. So what you see then is that all of these things can have an impact on how you see yourself. I remember I've been a Colts fan for a long time, and I remember watching the Super Bowl where the New Orleans Saints beat the Colts. Had an onside kick in the second half, kind of took momentum away, and after that was over with, feeling really bummed. Right, I didn't contribute to the game, I didn't lose the game, but that was part of my identity. So if they had, when they won the Super Bowl, that was one of those things that was a euphoric experience, right? Your team has won this, and you feel like that you're a part. So all of these components help make up our idea of who we are. So how do we know, right? We have what are called socialization agents that help us with this, and they can either encourage our view of self or discourage our view of self. Your first socialization agents are your parents. And depending on the family dynamic they set up, the parent-child dynamic they set up, this can have a lot to do with the way that you see yourself. You also have the same type of dynamics with your siblings. If you've got brothers and sisters, birth order psychology is one of kind of the interesting areas of the field. And there are psychologists that look and say, if you're the youngest child, there are certain traits that you take on. If you're the oldest child, there are certain traits. But it suggests that our relationship with those folks, your relationship, later when you move into school with teachers, where you fit in that particular instance, colleagues when you're going to work later, what's your role in the office. One of my favorite sitcoms the last 10 years is The Office, and everybody, Jim, Dwight, Pam, they all had kind of this role that they played in this dynamic of the workplace that was going to be there. We also can get this from romantic partners, that the people that we date help us define who we are in that type of relationship setting. And so all of these socialization agents are working outside of us. Remember, this is the social self is what we create from the opinions or even the belief of opinions from people on the outside. Your brother may never say, that he thinks this about you, but if you think that your brother thinks this about you, that can have an effect on who you are and how you're fitting in. So what we end up with when we add all of that stuff together, is what's called a working self concept. And the working self concept is who you are at that point in time in a particular situation. So it's self knowledge that's brought to mind by the context of the situation, right? Who are you in that particular moment? Your teacher puts you in a group and you've got to work. Are you the person that says, okay, I'm going to be the person that kind of takes charge and makes sure that everybody's doing what they're doing, and I'm going to lead this group? Or are you the type of person that hangs back and says, all right, I'm going to be quiet here because I'm not comfortable, really speaking out in large groups of people, but I'm going to do what needs to be done later. When you get in a particular thing, say you're on a sports team, and you say, this is the time where I'm going to take over. I'm going to put the team on my back, and I'm going to make sure that we don't lose. Right? Who are you in the context of where you find yourself right then? And that's the idea of a working self concept, and we have that all the time. Right? When you go, you probably have a different working self concept at school, at home, when you're with your friends, when you're with your family, if you have a job at your workplace. All of those things can be very different. So, what kind of influences do we have? Right? Well, there are a couple of different types. We can have cultural influences about who we are. One of the things we looked at first is the idea of an individualistic versus a collectivist culture. An individualistic culture, if you look on the side, is kind of an independent view of self. Who I am isn't influenced. You're surrounded by all of those other people who are informing that. But if you look at the interdependent, very much a more collective type, that those people have, at least by the diagram, a lot more influence on how you end up seeing yourself. And so that will, again, contribute to who you're seeing. So your culture can do that. Your gender can do that, right? How we define ourselves, can be affected by, are you coming at it from a male perspective or a female perspective? Is one of the things psychologists have looked at. Usually, what we find is that it's a little easier for males to be independent, and females are a little more interdependent, simply because of maybe a greater ease with sharing emotions and connections with one gender versus another. So all of those things can influence us, but there are other factors that say how greatly they influence us. If you're from a really tight knit family, you do a lot of things together. You're always around each other. You may be a little more interdependent than somebody whose family was still there, but doesn't maybe celebrate those same connections that other groups would have. The funny thing is, if we don't know who we are, especially in a particular situation, we have kind of a fallback position that we go to. And so what we do is, if we don't have any other way of judging how we're acting, we look at other people and we judge ourselves based on others. Right? At least I'm not like this. Or, well, I'm not as polished or as classy as this person, right? So if we get in a situation and we don't have anything to tell us who we are, we default to comparing ourselves to other people. And usually when we compare ourselves to other people, what we find is we try to tear down those other people in order to build ourselves up. And Leon Festinger, 1954, came up with social comparison theory. And that's basically what the idea was. If we don't have anything else, we'll look at somebody else and say, at least I'm better than that person. Or, man, I don't have it together, I'm not nearly as good as that person. Now, that's taking out a lot of what you know about yourself and you've learned. So there are a lot of, obviously, more positive core deep values with the other set. But when we don't have anything else, we kind of default to this. And so what we end up with, kind of to finish up, is the idea of self-knowledge. So what do we know about ourselves, right? We get self-schemas. We talked about schemas in a previous video. Schemas are kind of scripts for how we do things. And so we say, hey, when I am in this particular situation, this is how I act, right? When I get around everybody, I'm the life of the party. And so I will turn on that particular part of my personality. I will behave in a particular way. Or when I go, when I'm here, I feel much more confident about myself. Or I don't feel as confident about myself. You go into math class, just don't feel as confident with that material. It'll influence how you're acting. Self-reference is another way of organizing. And so the idea is that if something relates to something we're interested in, we're more likely to remember it. And so if I can make a personal connection with some type of material that I'm trying to learn or some kind of task I'm trying to perform, I am much more likely to end up being able to recall whatever information it is that I'm trying to fix up. And what ends up happening is we try to make ourselves very complex. Think about it. If you base your idea of self on one or two things, what happens when those one or two things are taken away? If you're just see yourself as an athlete, but you get injured, or your athletic career is over, you're not able to go to whatever the next step would be, then we suffer a crisis of self. Right? We don't know who we are anymore. You see this a lot of times with former athletes. People have always done that, always been good at it, but for the most of them, 40 years old is about as far as they can go. What do they do with themselves afterwards? How do they define who they are as a person when this really important part of who they are is gone? And so what happens is we try to be as complex as possible. We try to have as many different things about us as we can, with the idea being that if we're very complex, then we don't have to worry about what happens if one of those things falls away, because we've got a lot more that's helping to define us. And so one or two areas taking a hit doesn't necessarily send our whole kind of self-concept crumbling. One more example: if you define yourself by a romantic relationship that you're in, right? You kind of cut off all other parts, your friends, other parts of your personality and things. Then all of a sudden that person breaks up with you. How do you define yourself then? And you can see that happening quite a bit as well. But all of this stuff comes from kind of this idea of who the self is, self-concept, and then self-knowledge. So what we're going to look at next time out is the idea of self-esteem.